Suppose that Jupiter and Saturn have been orbiting the Sun from eternity past. Now, which will have completed the most number of orbits? The correct mathematical answer is that the number of their orbits is identical. But that seems absurd. For the longer they orbit, the further the disparity between them grows. So how does the number of their orbits magically become identical just by making them orbit from eternity past? These and many other examples suggest that infinity is just an idea in your mind, not something that exists in reality. But that entails that since past events are not just ideas in your mind, but are real, the number of past events must be finite. Therefore, the series of past events can't go back and back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist. Man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Now, Dr. Atkins is a reasonable man, and therefore he should be convinced by the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem and face this problem of a cosmic beginning. And in fact, as I say in his book, he does so. He argues that the way you get around the problem is by saying that nothing exists, that there was nothing then and there is nothing now, but I didn't hear a response to my refutation of that the argument for that based on positive and negative energy is misguided, and secondly, that the conclusion is absurd because it's self-contradictory and all.
As to morality, one is led by religion into dreadful corners of the world. Let me remind you of an article that appeared in The Independent last week. It touches upon Manchester. Worshippers in Manchester, perhaps you were among them, although what I'm about to say suggests that you were not. Worshippers in Manchester have stopped taking life-saving drugs after being persuaded about the healing power of God. And a BBC London investigation yesterday revealed that
my doctoral studies at the University of Birmingham, we came to have a warm affection for this country and her people, and I consider it a real joy and a delight to be here with you tonight. Thank you very much for coming. Now, in tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, there are good reasons to think that theism is true, and secondly, there are not comparably good reasons to think that atheism is true. Now, I'll leave it up to Dr. Atkins to present his arguments for atheism before I respond to them. In this opening speech, I want to sketch briefly 3 lines of evidence that weigh in favor of God's existence. As a professional philosopher, I think that God makes sense of a wide range of the data of human experience, including philosophical, scientific, moral, and historical considerations. Number 1, then, the origin of the universe. Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Why anything at all exists rather than nothing? Did the universe have a beginning? Or does it just go back and back forever? Typically, atheists have said that the universe is just eternal and uncaused. But there are good reasons, both philosophical and scientific, to call into question that assumption. Philosophically, the idea of an infinite past is very problematic. If the universe never had a beginning, that means that the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But the real existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to metaphysical absurdities. To give just one example, suppose you had an actually infinite number of coins numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on to infinity. And suppose I took away all the odd-numbered coins. How many coins would you have left? Well, you'd still have all the even-numbered coins, or an infinity of coins. So infinity minus infinity is infinity. But now suppose instead that I took away all the coins numbered greater than 3. Now how many coins would you have left? 3. So infinity minus infinity is 3. In each case, I took away an identical number of coins from an identical number of coins and came up with contradictory results. In fact, you can subtract infinity from infinity and get any result from 0 to infinity. For this reason, inverse operations like subtraction and division are simply prohibited in transfinite arithmetic. But in the real world in which we live, such a convention has no sway. Obviously, you can give away any coins that you want. Here's another example of the absurdity of an infinite past. Take the planets Jupiter and Saturn. Suppose that for every orbit that Saturn completes around the Sun, Jupiter completes 2. If Saturn has completed 10 orbits, Jupiter has completed 20. If Saturn has completed 1 trillion, Jupiter has completed 2 trillion. The longer they orbit, the further Saturn falls behind. If they continue to orbit forever, then they will approach a limit at which Saturn will be infinitely far behind Jupiter. But now turn the story around. Suppose that Jupiter and Saturn have been orbiting the Sun from eternity past. Now, which will have completed the most number of orbits? The correct mathematical answer is that the number of their orbits is identical. But that seems absurd. For the longer they orbit, the further the disparity between them grows. So how does the number of their orbits magically become identical just by making them orbit from eternity past? These and many other examples suggest that infinity is just an idea in your mind, not something that exists in reality. But that entails that since past events are not just ideas in your mind, but are real, the number of past events must be finite. Therefore, the series of past events can't go back and back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist. This purely philosophical conclusion has been confirmed by remarkable discoveries in astronomy and astrophysics. We now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. In 2003, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to prove that any universe which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. What makes their proof so powerful is that it holds regardless of the physical description of the early universe. Because we don't yet have a quantum theory of gravity, we can't yet provide a physical description of the first split second of the universe. But
William Lane Craig opens by asking a question few want to touch. Why is there something rather than nothing? For him, both logic and science point to one answer. The universe had a beginning. And things that begin don't just pop into existence uncaused. He points to the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, which makes it clear. Even if there are multiple universes, all signs still point to a starting line. No eternal past, no infinite timeline. Just a beginning that demands an explanation. Peter Atkins, representing the atheist view, leans hard on science, suggesting that the universe could arise from nothing. But that nothing isn't really nothing. It's a quantum vacuum governed by laws, math, and energy. That's something hiding behind a label. Of course, Craig doesn't let it slide. If the universe began, and that vacuum isn't truly nothing, then what triggered existence itself? You can sidestep the question. You can rename the problem. But at some point you have to face it. Either everything came from absolutely nothing, or something beyond the universe started it all? Let's see where Atkins takes it from here.
I think we should agree that theism is the more plausible worldview.
Thank you, Professor Craig. Can I ask Professor Atkins now to give his opening presentation?
Thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. My immediate task, of course, is to set up my stall, not to respond to Dr. Craig's arguments at this stage. That will come later, although, as you will see, some of my remarks now will in fact touch upon what he has just raised. In fact, my task is to bring you forward from the 11th century, where you've been immersed with considerable erudition for the past 20 minutes, and bring you into the 21st century, and to present arguments based on 1,000 years of increasing knowledge about the world. Dr. Craig would have been a wonderful medieval apologist, and it's a pleasure to hear his erudite reprise, with a few elaborations, of course, of what could have been said 1,000 years ago. I do not say that scornfully. Dr. Craig has touched on arguments that have long troubled thinkers, believers, and disbelievers alike, and their longevity underlines their importance to mankind. But first, an admission. I cannot prove that God does not exist. Everything there is could be the creation of an extraordinary entity that surpasses our understanding. It could be that the universe was created only a millisecond ago, with all our memories suddenly but falsely in place. It could be, as God is outside time, whatever that meaningless phrase means, that he hasn't decided even to make us yet. It's just conceivable that God did indeed create the universe 13.7 billion years ago. I cannot prove that he did not. All I can do is to assemble evidence that leads to the conclusion that God is not necessary for any aspect of the current world, and that there is a far simpler explanation for everything than the assertion of the existence of an omnipotent God. I have to say, of course, that many hold that the assertion that God made it is far, far simpler as an explanation of everything than a more pedestrian account in terms of physical laws. God, they say, is surely a simpler explanation than complex mechanism. Don't be seduced. The assertion that God did anything is simplistic rather than simple, and it is lazy. It is simplistic because an entity as functionally unbounded as a God must be of extraordinary complexity. It is lazy because it avoids becoming involved in untangling the web of events that have led to us. Any argument that simply asserts that God did it is a sign of a lazy mind, a mind that is content to wallow in assertion rather than embark upon climbing the intellectual Everest of comprehension. My argument against God is that there is nothing in the universe that cannot be explained, in prospect at least, without invoking that complex hypothesis. In other words, there are simpler explanations, or at least the prospect of simpler explanations, for absolutely everything. Because there are simpler explanations, or the prospect of them, there is no need to burden our understanding with the assertion that there is something more, namely an incomprehensible God. That billions of people believe to the contrary is of no consequence. Truth is not arrived at by majority vote. There are clearly huge psychological and cultural pressures imposed on people from an early age, and belief has been honed by the powerful into a potent weapon of crowd control. In the nasty, brutish brevity of an impoverished life, great comfort comes from the belief that there is better to come. There is also satisfaction that wrongdoers, wealthy perhaps on earth, will get their comeuppance in the afterlife. Even the meek are in with a chance. Angst and hope, angst at the prospect of one's own annihilation, and hope for unbounded ecstasy to come are potent drivers into the jaws of belief. But the potency of the drivers and the huge majority of the hoopers does not mean that the belief is correct. I've made a strong but carefully worded claim that there is nothing in the universe that cannot be explained or has the prospect of being explained without invoking a God. I need to justify that claim. If you accept my argument that a God is unnecessary, then your only recourse, if you insist on believing that there is a God, is to admit that you are driven by your heart rather than your head. But hearts are unreliable organs of knowledge. I shall deal with 6 points: contingency, fitness, purpose, miracles, including resurrections, theodicy, and morality. Obviously, and perhaps mercifully, I don't have time to be thorough on any of these topics, but perhaps by setting out the ground we can turn to finer arguments later. In each case, I shall argue that modern science, the agent of the new Enlightenment, promises, I can offer no more than that, to elucidate what theology has long obscured. First, contingency. Science currently doesn't have the slightest clue about how a universe can come into existence out of absolutely nothing without intervention. I will leave aside whether the universal is eternal in some sense and without a beginning. That's something to be determined by observation, not by the ruminations of philosophy. We simply don't know. To make it harder for myself, I shall suppose for the sake of argument that there was a beginning. But there are 2 kinds of beginning, and it's important to distinguish them. One type of beginning is when an already existing universe gives rise to a daughter universe. Another type of a beginning is when absolutely nothing turns into a universe. I shall call that latter universe an original universe. Now, as you've just heard, some assert that a universe can spring from a quantum fluctuation. That may be true of a daughter universe, for an already existing mother universe has physical laws and a richly propertied vacuum. But when there is absolutely nothing, there are no physical laws, no quantum fluctuation. It's an empty term for the emergence of an original universe. And to make things harder for myself, but with an eye on trying to answer and not evade a deeply important question, I shall set aside the simpler problem of a daughter universe and consider the formation of an original universe. Did that original universe, although perhaps contingent, have to be caused? You have to realize that physical laws, which are summaries of observed behavior, come into existence as a universe comes into existence. That includes issues of causality. It is naive in the extreme to extrapolate our own experience of causality, which is essentially the working out of the consequences of physical laws, to an era before those laws existed. It is entirely possible that the unique event that marked the inception of the physical laws was itself an uncaused event. And what science has to do, in due course, is to discover how absolutely nothing can tumble into being and become apparently something. Is there any reason to believe that it might succeed? There's no doubt that its actually edging towards that goal by burrowing back in time to discover that there was what there was immediately after the creation event. Look how far it has come in the past 100 years. We are starting to be confident about what first appeared.
Peter Atkins begins with a clear position. The existence of God cannot be disproven, but the concept is not required to explain the universe. His argument rests on the view that every observable phenomenon can, in principle, be understood through natural processes. There is no need to introduce a supernatural cause when the available tools of science already address the questions once reserved for theology. In physics, the origin of the universe is explored through models based on quantum field theory and general relativity. Physicists such as Edward Tryon, Alexander Vilenkin, and Alan Guth have developed frameworks in which a universe can emerge from a quantum vacuum. These models are grounded in established physical principles and published in peer-reviewed contexts. They examine conditions where space, time, matter, and energy do not yet exist in classical forms. The quantum vacuum in these models is not empty space, but a pre-geometric state governed by probabilistic fluctuations. It has no particles or fields in the classical sense, but it permits spontaneous events due to its underlying structure. This is not a speculative leap. It is derived from the mathematics used to describe quantum systems and is consistent with the theoretical foundations of modern cosmology. Experimental advancements continue to inform these models, including those from particle accelerators, satellite measurements of the cosmic microwave background, and high-precision gravitational data. Physical laws, in this view, are not prescriptive forces imposed from outside. They describe regularities that emerge as physical systems develop. The law-like behavior observed in nature reflects consistent patterns rather than imposed order. Causality, time, and space are not treated as eternal categories but as emergent properties tied to the structure of the system. Atkins also addresses ethics and human behavior. Moral norms, cooperation, and legal structures are developed through social interaction, negotiation, and institutional memory. These systems function through accountability, shared understanding, and revision, not through appeals to divine authority. Global studies show that societies without strong religious frameworks continue to build systems that address justice, welfare, and civil order through public mechanisms. Historically, many institutions that shape human rights, medicine, and law have emerged through empirical inquiry and political struggle rather than from sacred texts. Legislative assemblies, universities, courts, and scientific academies operate through transparent procedures and ongoing correction. Changes in legal rights, bodily autonomy, and freedom of expression were often developed through public debate, not religious mandate.
I'd like to perhaps paraphrase a remark by the economist J.K. Galbraith, who said that astrology was invented in order to make economic forecasting look respectable. I'd like to say that theology was invented to make philosophy look respectable. You've heard nothing but obfuscation. Let me remind you, because I have to, my first rebuttal refers to the first 20 minutes of Dr. Craig's presentation, rather than his immediate one. The level of argument that we heard relating to the eternal nature of the universe, it was that planets clearly have not been going round the sun an infinite number of times. I shorten the rather ludicrous argument that we actually heard. No one ever says that. He's raised a straw man. What we're really concerned about is whether the universe itself is infinite. And we can measure the life of the solar system as about 5 billion years. We can measure the life of the universe as 13.7 billion years. We weren't talking about that at all. We were talking about whether their sequence of universes might be infinite and that there was never actually a beginning. You cannot argue against that by philosophy. You cannot argue against that by theology. the only way you can argue about it is by looking at the evidence, and we heard no evidence whatsoever. And arguments about infinity are always extraordinarily doubtful. I mean, Professor Craig said that an infinite number of events has never occurred in the universe. I refer him to Zeno, halving the distance again, never getting anywhere. But clearly, if you've got an infinite number of halving of the distances, you get anywhere you want to. So never listen to an argument about infinity. It's infinitely slippery. The travesty of my remarks about nothing coming from nothing. Let me take that as an example. What I wanted to show is that science is circumspect in the way that it approaches the great questions of being. Okay, it looks around, and if you're a naive looker around a philosopher, a theologian, a gardener, a farmer, you will see a huge amount of energy in the universe, and you will marvel at God's bounty. But then, as a scientist, you think again, and you say, yes, I can measure the amount of energy in the universe. I won't just lie back and think about it. I will measure it, because once I put numbers to ideas, they become testable and verifiable. And to determine the energy of the universe, the first thing I do is to weigh it. So I weigh the mass, I determine the mass of a galaxy, and then I multiply it by the square of the speed of light. And through E equals mc squared, I get the energy that that galaxy represents. I do it for this galaxy, that galaxy, this galaxy, every galaxy in the universe, not just the ones we can see. And I get a colossal value. And I lie back and wonder at God's munificence. And then I say, but I've forgotten something, which is the gravitational attraction between galaxies. And whenever you have two attracting bodies, they lower their energy. And if you take the gravitational attraction of this galaxy with that one, it lowers that first sum we got a little bit. Then this galaxy with that one, this galaxy with that one, this galaxy with that one. And the signs are, and we're not completely certain about this, because we do not jump to conclusions in science. We are circumspect, imaginative, and honest. We find that that gravitational attraction reduces that original huge energy we had to zero. In other words, God's munificence was zero. And you don't need a God if the God isn't going to give you anything. What science does is to simplify the questions that need to be answered. It doesn't say, there was nothing originally, there's nothing now. What it does is to simplify the question that needs to be asked. We're moving cautiously, imaginatively, and reliably to understanding the incipience of the universe by identifying what questions truly have to be answered. There is nothing here, I will concede that, but it's an extremely interesting form of nothing. There was nothing originally, there is nothing here now, but it's through whatever event took place at the inception of the universe, it became an interesting form of nothing, which seems to be something. It may be metaphysical, and it may sound stupid, but what I'm doing is identifying the question that needs to be answered, not just sitting back in awe and saying, look at the universe, fantastic job, it obviously needed someone really rather special to do it. The resurrection, if I can jump forward, I do notice that Professor Craig, although I made 6 points, did not deal with all 6. Perhaps I should deal with all 3 of his. His second, of course, was the objectivity of moral values. To say that you cannot be moral without a God is frankly disgusting. I am moral. I do not believe that I am guided by a God. And I think it casts a slur on atheists everywhere in the world to presume that they are evil because they believe there is no God. Morals, as I asserted in my opening presentation, the emergence of morals should be understood. They should not simply be accepted. You should try to find the roots of moral behavior, hard as it is to trace the emergence of moral thinking as one's own body begins at one cell and turns into a trillion cells as evolution proceeds through billions of years, as people begin to think about the consequences of their actions. That's the way to understand morality, not just to lie back and think that there is an umpire in the sky somewhere. Try to understand. All I'm saying is that it is healthier to understand. If Voltaire said in one of my favorite quotations that people who believe in absurdities commit atrocities. And I think we see that in religious belief, where atrocities are affected in the name of dogma. The resurrection, I must deal with that in miracles. Of course, David Hume got it right when he said that there's always more reason to disbelieve the report than there is to believe what is reported. Look at the Gospels. You can't really believe it. Pretend we were writing about events 60 years ago when there was no actual real record. We wouldn't get it right. We'd make up a lot of it. The Gospels are political propaganda sheets, and it's inevitable and understandable that they were invented to make the point that they were trying to make. Yes, Joshua, if he existed, Jesus, I suppose you might call him, and I can well believe that in the Palestine of 2,000 years ago, there were lots of Joshuas around, that was probably a very nice man, and was certainly written up to be a very nice man by the people compiling the Gospels to establish the creed that they wanted to. But the actual evidence is extremely slender. The evidence in favor of an actual resurrection is compiled by those who start from a prejudicial point of view that it did occur and then seek to justify it. Others, those who deny the resurrection, say, this is such an extraordinary event, we need real extraordinary evidence to support it. And there is no real extraordinary evidence to support it. So why should you believe it? Because you can see that it was invented as a political manifesto? No, you cannot possibly believe it. And all this gibberish about having to justify atheism, I mean, that's another example of false premise. If I come into a room and say, I don't understand anything, I will start from the simplest explanation, and I will let you convince me.
Peter Atkins lays out two key points, both grounded in what science and history actually show. First, the claim that the universe requires a divine beginning doesn't match how cosmology works. Physicists like Edward Tryon and Alexander Vilenkin have developed models showing that a universe can emerge from a quantum vacuum, a state with no classical matter, space, or time. This isn't a loophole. It's a real possibility supported by quantum field theory, the same framework that underpins much of modern physics. In this framework, the total energy of the universe, once gravitational effects are included, may balance to zero. If that's the case, then the question of where the energy came from doesn't even need to be asked. There's no debt, no transaction, just a starting point that unfolds through known physical principles. Second, Morality doesn't require belief in a deity to exist or to function. Human behavior, cooperation, and ethical reasoning can be traced through evolution, social dynamics, and shared experience. Data from Pew and Gallup show that people in non-religious societies still support justice, fairness, and care for others. Atkins doesn't reject meaning or mystery. He rejects the idea that those things need to be filled with untestable claims. When it comes to miracles like the resurrection, the same principle applies. Claims that break natural patterns require more than tradition. They need evidence. Where do you stand? Do you think morality depends on religion, or can we shape ethics and compassion without it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If this gave you ideas, be sure to like, subscribe, and share to keep the conversation going.
Let's now consider the challenges for Craig's view. In my last speech, I pointed out that to believe Craig's view, you'd have to believe that the fact that you could stop 1 million Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is not sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. You'd also have to believe that without God, there's nothing evil in 1 million Holocausts.
As St. Anselm saw, God is, by definition, the greatest conceivable being, and therefore perfectly good. The question before us this evening is, what is the best account of the objectivity of moral values and duties? What makes certain actions objectively good or evil, right or wrong? In tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, theism provides a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. Second, atheism does not provide as sound a foundation as theism for the objectivity of moral values and duties. So let's look at that first contention together. Here, I want to examine two subpoints with you. First, theism provides a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral values. Moral values have to do with what is good or evil. On the theistic view, objective moral values are grounded in God. As St. Anselm saw, God is, by definition, the greatest conceivable being, and therefore perfectly good. He is not merely perfectly good, he is the paradigm of moral value. God's own holy and loving character supplies the absolute standard against which all things are measured. He is, by nature, loving, generous, faithful, kind, and so forth. Thus, if God exists, moral values are objective, being wholly independent of human beings. Second, theism provides a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral duties. On a theistic view, objective moral duties are constituted by God's will or commands. God's moral nature is expressed in relation to us in the form of divine commandments, which constitute our moral duties or obligations. Far from being arbitrary, God's commandments must be consistent with his holy and loving nature. Our duties, then, are constituted by God's commandments, and these, in turn, reflect his essential character. On this foundation, we can affirm the objective rightness of love, generosity, and self-sacrifice, and condemn as objectively wrong selfishness, hatred, abuse, and oppression. In summary, then, theism grounds the objectivity of both moral values and moral duties. Hence, it's evident that if God does exist, we have a sound foundation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. Let's turn then to my second contention, that atheism does not provide as sound a foundation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. I'm not going to argue this point in general. Rather, I want to look specifically at Dr. Wielenberg's view, which he calls godless normative realism, and ask whether it provides as sound a foundation for morality as theism. I'm going to argue that godless normative realism not only involves extravagant metaphysical commitments, which make it very implausible, but it also faces a number of formidable objections as an account of objective moral values and duties. First, godless normative realism involves extravagant metaphysical claims which make it very implausible. Because Dr. Wielenberg wants to affirm the objectivity and even necessity of moral values and duties, he cannot take them to be mere byproducts of biological evolution or social conditioning. Rather, he must find some transcendent ground for the objectivity of moral values and duties. He finds this in moral Platonism. His view is akin to mathematical Platonism, which holds that in addition to the world of concrete objects, there exists a transcendent realm of immaterial, causally effete, abstract objects, like numbers, sets, and other mathematical entities. Most of us think that such entities have at most a sort of conceptual reality. But for the Platonist, these objects are objectively real. Wielenberg holds that moral values are similarly abstract objects of some sort, existing independently of human beings. When the right physical situations occur in the world, these abstract objects supervene on the situations. So, for example, the abstract object, goodness, supervenes on two people's loving each other, so that their loving each other is objectively good. Platonism is a metaphysical view which is so extravagant that it makes theism, which itself involves hefty metaphysical commitments, look modest by comparison. The prominent metaphysician Peter van Inwagen explains, the Platonist must think of objects of what there is as falling into two exclusive and exhaustive categories, the abstract and the concrete. If X falls into one of these categories and Y into the other, then no two things could be more different than X and Y. The differences between God and this pen pale into insignificance when they are compared with the differences between this pen and the number 4. Indeed, the number seems no more like the pen than like God. The difference between any abstract object and any concrete object would seem to be the maximum difference any two objects could display. Given this strange bifurcation of reality into these two causally unconnected domains, it would be much more credible to suppose that one of the categories is empty. But concrete objects are indisputably real and well understood, in contrast to abstract objects. So, Van Inwagen maintains, the presumption should be that abstract objects do not exist. Nominalism of some sort is thus the default position. Indeed, Van Inwagen believes one should not believe in abstract objects unless one feels rationally compelled by some weighty consideration or argument. A philosopher should wish not to be a Platonist if it's rationally possible for the informed philosopher not to be a Platonist. The objectivity of moral values cannot itself provide such a rationally compelling reason, since Dr. Wielenberg acknowledges that he has no rationally compelling arguments either for the objectivity of moral values or for moral Platonism. He thus cannot overcome the presumption against Platonism and hence against godless normative realism. The theist, by contrast, faces no such obstacle because he grounds moral values in a concrete object, namely God, and so is not committed to a realm of abstract.
Craig claims that God provides the only solid foundation for objective moral values and duties. But this idea collapses under scrutiny. First, grounding morality in God's character creates what's known as the Euthyphro dilemma. Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? If morality depends on God's will, then it's arbitrary. God could declare cruelty or genocide good, and we'd be forced to accept it. If God commands things because they're already good, then morality exists independently of God, which defeats Craig's entire point. Second, Craig criticizes Wielenberg's view for being metaphysically extravagant, but belief in a timeless, immaterial, all-powerful being who created the universe is hardly modest. In fact, philosophers like Graham Oppy and J. L. Mackie argue that postulating moral facts is actually less speculative than inventing an invisible deity to explain them. And third, we don't need a God to explain why abuse or oppression is wrong. Evolutionary biology, cognitive science, and social cooperation offer strong, natural explanations for why humans develop shared moral norms. Studies from Franz de Waal and Michael Tomasello show empathy, fairness, and even altruism in non-human primates. Morality doesn't need religion to exist. It needs minds capable of valuing others.
Let's now consider the challenges for Craig's view. In my last speech, I pointed out that to believe Craig's view, you'd have to believe that the fact that you could stop 1 million Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is not sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. You'd also have to believe that without God, there's nothing evil in 1 million Holocausts. You may have noticed that Craig didn't dispute these implications of his view. Indeed, he didn't mention them at all. His only reply here is that, quote, "The ultimate source of our moral obligations is far beyond our experience," end quote. So I say that the fact that you could stop 1 million Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. Craig says that it might seem that way, but really it takes an order from God to render that nap immoral. Second, Craig's view makes the occurrence of morally wrong acts inexplicable, because by commanding us to do what he knows we won't do anyway, God would only create more evil. In my last speech, I pointed out a simple defect in Craig's attempt to answer this challenge. Craig didn't address this defect in his last speech, so I'll just remind you of it. Suppose I perform some evil act, like heartlessly ignoring the suffering child. Craig says that because I deserve to be punished for my evil act, God must forbid the act so that he can then punish me. The problem, again, is that if the act deserves punishment because it is evil, then God is justified in punishing me for the evil act without first forbidding the act. As I said in my last speech, if I deserve punishment for ignoring the child even without a divine command, then God can simply punish me. The command is superfluous. Third, the presence of psychopaths in the world creates a contradiction within Craig's view. Psychological research shows that whether or not psychopaths know the difference between right and wrong, they are incapable of grasping the authority of morality. Remember that in trying to explain how God could impose obligations on people who don't believe in him, Craig proposed that by giving non-believers an intuitive grasp of morality's demands and authority, God is able to get his commands through and impose moral obligations on non-believers. However, because psychopaths cannot grasp morality's authority, God hasn't imposed any moral obligations on them, which means that, on Craig's view, they have no moral obligations. In a striking turn of events, Dr. Craig, despite having railed for years against atheism's inability to account for the moral wrongness of the acts of psychopaths, and having declared tonight that Christianity teaches that God has written the demands of his moral law on the hearts of all people, now entertains the possibility that psychopaths do not know the difference between right and wrong and are not culpable for their evil acts. But remember that in his flawed attempt to explain wrong action, Craig said that it was unacceptable for evildoers to get away with evil, and that God would never permit such a thing. Here are Craig's own words, quote, "By issuing general commands to humankind, God is able to hold those who do evil acts responsible for their actions. Without such commands, evildoers could act with impunity and face no divine judgment, for they wouldn't have done anything wrong. They would literally get away with murder, which is unacceptable," end quote. So Craig must hold that psychopaths are culpable for their evil acts, and so do have moral obligations. For otherwise, some psychopaths would, as he puts it, literally get away with murder. We can now see that Craig has painted himself into a corner in tonight's debate. Since psychopaths are incapable of recognizing morality's authority, Craig must deny that they have moral obligations. Yet he must also hold that God doesn't let them get away with their evil acts, and so they do have moral obligations. I hope you will listen carefully to Dr. Craig's closing remarks and pay careful attention to what, if anything, he says about the three challenges I've just explained. The first two challenges show that Craig's view has deeply implausible implications, including that there are no wrong actions and that the fact that you could stop 1 million Holocausts simply by lifting a finger is not sufficient by itself to make it morally wrong for you to take a nap instead. The third challenge is even more serious because it reveals a contradiction in Craig's position. Craig's position leads to the impossible view that psychopaths both do and do not have moral obligations. Please listen carefully to what, if anything, Dr. Craig has to say about these three challenges in his closing remarks.
Wielenberg exposes a dangerous flaw in Craig's view. If morality depends entirely on God's command, then without God, even something like stopping 1 million Holocausts wouldn't actually be morally required. That's not just absurd, it's deeply unsettling. We don't need a divine order to know that letting millions suffer when we could help is wrong. Our moral intuitions, combined with reason and empathy, are more than enough, and that's supported by evolutionary psychology and neuroscience. Studies from institutions like Oxford and Harvard have shown that human brains are wired with empathy, fairness, and harm avoidance, even in infants, long before they're taught religion. Wielenberg also highlights the contradiction in Craig's logic with psychopaths. Psychologists like Dr. Kent Keel have proven that many psychopaths can't experience moral emotions like guilt or understand moral responsibility the way others do. If Craig is right, they're not morally obligated. But if they aren't, then according to Craig's own words, they get away with murder. That completely undermines the idea that God's commands are a consistent moral framework. In reality, Wielenberg's godless moral realism fits better with what we observe in the real world. Our moral sense doesn't require a supernatural source to exist or to matter.
Does your view address cases where moral duties conflict? For example, the classic case of lying to protect Jews from Nazi soldiers that appear at your door.
Yeah, so the way, the view I hold, the sort of where what is morally required of us depends on what moral reasons we have, is similar to the view put forward by the early 20th century philosopher W.D. Ross. So the basic idea is morality is kind of messy. There are all these different things that provide moral reasons for us to do certain things or not do certain things. And it's when you're trying to figure out what to do, a lot of times it's just a matter of weighing these reasons against each other. And so I would think in that case, I mean, that's just a particularly difficult case in the sense that you've got sort of weighty moral reasons on both sides, and it may be very difficult to know what the right thing to do is. So there are a lot of easy cases, like if you promise to meet someone for lunch, and here's a classic example from philosophy land, filled with drowning babies. So you promise to meet someone for lunch, you're passing through philosophy land, here's a drowning baby. If you save the baby, you'll break the promise. There it seems clear that the reason to the importance of saving the baby outweighs the promise. But there are other cases that are harder. I think if the question is about conflicting duties, I would think of those cases as cases where you just have weighty reasons on both sides, and it's hard to tell what your duty is, but there wouldn't literally be conflicting duties. There would be one actual obligation. It can just be very hard to know what it is when you've got weighty reasons sort of pulling in conflicting directions.
It seems to me that this highlights the problem of trying to derive moral obligations from simply normative considerations of weighing the moral values of alternative actions. Indeed, it makes me wonder what the situation with psychopaths would be on this sort of view, since they wouldn't be capable, in many cases I should think, of weighing the moral norms required to have an obligation. Certainly mentally retarded people and infants and people in comatose conditions would not be able to derive moral obligations in that way. Whereas I would say on my view, I was talking about normal moral agents, not mentally ill people, comatose people, little infants, mentally retarded. That's what I meant when I was referring to being written on the hearts of all people, was normal moral agents.
Okay, Dr. Craig, the next question is for you. The questioner asks, why should we obey God's commands? Where does that should come from? How is that should grounded in God?
Right. This relates to the question that came up a little bit in the debate about whether or not your moral theory has some sort of explanatory ultimate which cannot be further explained. And it seems to me the divine command theorist could say simply that this is my theory, that divine commands constitute our moral obligations, and therefore the question arises, doesn't even arise, well, why should I obey God's commands? Because that just is the theory that you're giving, and this is an explanatory ultimate that doesn't have a further explanation. Seems to me that would be perfectly legitimate move. But he could say something else. He could say that we are to obey God's commands because God has commanded us to. And that would not be viciously circular. For example, all of the things mentioned in the debate tonight is itself mentioned in the debate tonight. So there are things that are included in themselves. And if God issues a command, you shall obey all of my commands, that command itself would be comprised in that command. And so in this case, you're not left with some sort of brute explanatory ultimate. Rather, you would have an explanation for why you should obey God's commands, because God has commanded you to obey all his commands, including that one. So it seems to me that that would be a perfectly acceptable answer to the question that was raised by the questioner.
Okay, so I think this question is helpful. It brings out another sort of important parallel between, I think, mine and Craig's view, and actually, as far as I can tell, anybody who wants to believe in objective moral truths or facts, which is, at some point, you're going to need a moral axiom, where you have some basic moral claim or principle which has no further explanation outside of itself. And so I think sometimes in debates between theists and atheists about morality, it's presented this way: well, on the theist view, God is the foundation, then on the atheist view, they sort of have no foundation. That's very misleading. I think both views require moral axioms. The only difference is which moral axioms. On the particular question of why obey God's commands, I would just point out that the sort of most prominent defenders of divine command theory, for example, Robert Adams, they realize that this is a very pressing question. Robert Adams spends a lot of time trying to provide reasons to obey God's commands, and in doing so, he inevitably, predictably appeals to unexplained, brute moral axioms. So I think you can't get away from it.
Wielenberg is absolutely right. Every moral system has to start somewhere. But the moment Craig says, obey God because God said so, he's admitting that his foundation is just as unexplained. Worse, it's circular. He defines morality by God's will, then defines God's will as moral. That's not moral reasoning, that's obedience. Now compare that to Wielenberg's view. He says some moral truths, like suffering without justification is wrong, are self-evident, not because we feel them, but because they're rationally compelling. This idea has deep roots in moral philosophy. Thinkers like G.E. Moore and Christine Korsgaard argue that some values don't need grounding in a deity. They're built into the structure of reason itself. And science backs this up. Research from developmental psychologists like Paul Bloom shows that even babies, as young as 6 months, can recognize helpful versus harmful behavior. They prefer kind puppets over mean ones, long before they can be taught religion. That's hard evidence that moral understanding can emerge naturally. So when Wielenberg says we don't need God to explain moral truth, he's not dodging the question. He's offering a view that actually fits what we see in the real world, where morality isn't handed down from above, but built from empathy, logic, and human connection. So here's what we want to know. Do you think morality should come from authority or from reason and empathy? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like if this made you think, and don't forget to subscribe for more philosophy, facts, and debates that actually matter.
Why is it wrong, peculiarly, for human beings to inflict harm on each other?
All right, so let's start with that. Suppose that my 3-year-old nephew walks into your house, takes some book off your shelf, and tears the pages out. He hasn't done anything wrong, or 3-year-old's probably old enough, he has done something wrong. Make him 1.5 years, he hasn't done anything wrong. If I go into your house, tear some pages out of your book, I've done something wrong. What's the difference? Well, I'm capable of appreciating reasons for respecting your property that my 1.5-year-old, this is hypothetical 1.5-year-old nephew, doesn't have the capacity, right? There are differences between people that allow me and you to think about our behaviors, to evaluate our behaviors, to see whether or not there are legitimate reasons for behaving as we do. Creatures that don't have that capacity don't have that capacity. It's precisely because they lack that capacity that makes no sense that the notion of right and wrong behavior gets no purchase. Lions can't reflect upon their behavior, so when they do it, it's
Of social behavior, which they call acting morally.
We might wonder what makes it wrong. And the answer is, well, it's wrong because, for example, rape is wrong because it harms the victim. Is it just a matter of opinion? Now that's tricky. Of course, we're going to be arguing about whether or not God's necessary for morality, what shape morality has, and so forth and so on. And all of that, in some sense, is just a matter of opinion. But I take it the deeper question is there a fact of the matter as to who's right? Not just as there's a fact of the matter as to whether or not there is a God and what that God is like. I take it there's a fact of the matter with regard to whether or not it's wrong to harm people, whether it's wrong to rape, for example. I think it's wrong to rape. I take this to not just be a matter of opinion. It's not as though if I thought otherwise rape would be okay, or if everybody thought otherwise rape would be okay. Rape is wrong, full stop. So at least if you're worried about whether there could be genuine morality, where there are facts of the matter, then on an atheist account, I'm inclined to think, well, of course there can. We might wonder what makes it wrong. And the answer is, well, it's wrong because, for example, rape is wrong because it harms the victim. Might ask instead, what do we mean in saying that it's wrong to rape? Now, this is a controversial matter, and not all moral philosophers agree about the ingredients that we need to build into the basic definition of right and wrong. But roughly, I take it that as at least a first pass, the thought is something like to believe in morality as a genuine, objective state of affairs is to believe that there are reasons to act morally, to help others and to avoid harming them, and that these reasons don't depend on the particular desires or goals you happen to have. It's not as though if you happen to care about truth, justice, and the American way, then you've got a reason to act morally. No, everybody has these reasons. These reasons are overriding, to use philosophers' jargon, they're categorical reasons. So when I say that it's an objective fact that rape is wrong, what I'm saying is there's this kind of overriding, strong, categorical reason not to harm people in this way. And that's not up to me to make it so, it's just so. Now, we might ask, is there a deeper account that can be offered about where these reasons come from, or what makes them so, or the basic rules of morality, what their ultimate foundation or basis is? And I want to say that secular atheist philosophers disagree about that point. Some are, as we might call them, non-foundationalists. They say, well, we can state the various moral rules, keep your promises, tell the truth, don't tell lies, don't hurt people, help the needy. And if we want, we can boil these rules down into a simpler set of rules. I've suggested don't harm, do help. But there may be nothing at all deeper to be said about what makes those rules the valid rules. It's just an objective fact about reality that there are these categorical reasons. There are reasons to behave in certain ways versus other. So that's not just a matter of opinion. There are facts about what there are reasons to do. And these may be among the reasons that there's nothing deeper to say. But there are also philosophers who believe there is something more to say. And again, unsurprisingly, different philosophers will disagree about what that deeper story looks like. Let me give a very quick sketch of one such story. I think it's not bad as far as it goes. Ultimately, I think there's even more to say, but that would take us a rather long time to say that more. So let me just give you the quick sketch. It's a version of the view that's known as contractarianism. The thought is that the moral rules are the rules that we would give to one another to govern our interactions with one another, the rules that we would agree to if we were to set about trying to settle on a bunch of rules to govern our interactions under the assumption that we were perfectly rational. Nobody wants to follow rules that people accept because of mistakes in their reasoning. So imagine us, but soup ourselves up to be reasoning perfectly rational beings would agree to various rules to govern their interactions. And the rules that they agree to are the terms of morality. Now, there's different ways of running this contractarian thought. One version of it, which I have some sympathies to, adds an extra twist. The reasoning needs to take place behind a so-called veil of ignorance. The thought is, I'm not going to know while I'm engaged in this hypothetical bargaining session what my actual position in society is. I won't be able to try to rig things in favor of white males because I won't know that I'm a white male. So I argue from behind this veil of ignorance about my actual identity. So that's the basic thought. So here we have a kind of deeper story. Where do the moral rules come from? They are the rules we would give to ourselves to govern our behavior with one another insofar as we were perfectly rational. Does this capture a notion of objectivity for ethics? Seems to me the answer is yes. There's a fact of the matter about what it would be rational for us to agree to in terms of these rules. One might wonder, is the output of this hypothetical, imaginary bargaining session, are the moral rules necessary? Maybe that's another feature we're looking for in trying to genuinely get morality as opposed to merely the illusion or appearance of morality. And the answer to that is yes, I believe they are necessary. Now, if you're a non-foundationalist, if you don't think there is a deeper story of the contractarian sort that I sketched, or some other deeper story that other moral philosophers have sketched, if you're a non-foundationalist, you might just stop it right here. You might say, to say that murder is wrong is to say that there's a categorical reason not to murder. And this isn't a contingent truth, it's a necessary truth. It's a truth that obtains, as philosophers like to put it, in all possible worlds, that murder would be wrong. If we do go the contractarian route, then we instead might put our necessity a little bit deeper. We might say something like, the moral truths are necessary, but their truth is itself explained in terms of the social contract, and that in turn is explained in terms of the fact that there are certain truths about reasoning, and these are necessary truths. It's a necessary fact that perfectly rational beings would reason about what kinds of rules they wanted to give to one another in such and such a way. So I think we can get the necessity of morality as well. Here's a rather different objection that might get raised. We have the thought that morality involves commandments. We have the thought that morality involves requirements. We talk about moral laws. So sometimes it's suggested that where there's a commandment, there's got to be a commander. Where there's a law, there's got to be a lawgiver. Where there's a requirement, there's got to be a requirer. Who plays the role of commander, lawgiver, requirer? Well, it's got to be God. And so it turns out if we're really going to have the notion not just of moral reason to behave in this way or that way, but rather moral requirements to behave in one way rather than another way, then we need to appeal to God after all, to be the lawgiver. This is an argument that's been proposed by various theistic philosophers. Indeed, this very argument's been embraced by some atheistic philosophers who said, yeah, talk of moral requirements does presuppose a lawgiver. Now that I no longer believe in God, I believe there are no moral requirements. Now, I'm not myself inclined to go that way. I'm perfectly prepared to talk about moral requirements. I think it's a completely appropriate thing to do. In fact, it would be inappropriate, it would be just simply mistaken, full stop, to give up talk about moral requirements. So the question I want to push a little bit is it really true that requirements require a requirer? That's a mouthful.
Kagan's argument is grounded in some of the most well-respected traditions in philosophy and science. First, the claim that laws require a lawgiver is a category mistake. We talk about laws in physics, like gravity or thermodynamics, but no one thinks there's a divine being issuing those. Moral laws can function the same way. They describe how rational beings ought to treat each other, especially when suffering, fairness, or autonomy is involved. Second, Kagan's appeal to contractarianism isn't abstract theory. It reflects real-world values we use to build just societies. Think of the U.S. Constitution. It wasn't handed down from heaven. It was written by people trying to reason through fairness from multiple perspectives. That's the same spirit behind Rawls' veil of ignorance, which has influenced everything from ethics in healthcare to international human rights. And science backs this up. Frans de Waal's work with primates shows empathy, fairness, and conflict resolution emerging without religion. In human children, studies from Yale's Baby Lab show moral decision-making before they can speak, proving morality isn't downloaded from above. It's wired into social creatures like us.
The question before us this evening is God necessary for morality? Notice what the question is not asking. We are not asking whether belief in God is necessary for morality. No one in tonight's discussion is arguing that in order to live a moral life, you need to believe in God. Rather, the question, as Shelley emphasized, is whether God is necessary for morality. And the answer to that question, I think, obviously depends on what you mean by morality. If by morality you mean simply a certain pattern of social behavior prevalent among human beings, then obviously this sort of behavior could still go on even if it turned out that God does not exist. God isn't necessary in order for human beings to exhibit certain patterns of social behavior, which they call acting morally. But if by morality you mean that certain things are really good or evil, that certain actions are unconditionally obligatory or impermissible, then many atheists and theists alike agree that God is indeed necessary for morality. In the absence of God, morality turns out to be just a human convention or illusion. The same patterns of social behavior might go on without God, but it would be a delusion to think that such behavior has any objective moral significance. Accordingly, I'm going to argue that God is necessary for morality in at least three distinct ways. Without God, objective moral values, moral duties, and moral accountability would not exist. Let's look at the first point. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Now, when we talk about moral values, we're talking about whether something is good or evil. To say that there are objective moral values is to say that something is good or evil independently of whether anybody believes it to be so. To say, for example, that the Holocaust was objectively evil is to say that it was evil, even though the Nazis who carried it out thought that it was good. And it would still have been evil, even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in brainwashing or exterminating everybody who disagreed with them, so that everyone believed the Holocaust was good. My first claim is that if there is no God, then moral values are not objective in that sense. Traditionally, objective moral values have been based in God, who is the highest good. He is the locus and paradigm of moral value. God's own holy and loving nature supplies the absolute standard against which all actions are measured. He is by nature loving, generous, just, faithful, kind, and so forth. And thus, if God exists, objective moral values exist. But if God does not exist, what basis remains for objective moral values? In particular, why think that human beings would have moral worth? On the atheistic view, human beings are just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe in which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On atheism, I can't see any reason to think that human well-being is objectively good, any more than insect well-being or dog well-being or monkey well-being. On a naturalistic view, moral values are just the byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning. Just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative and even altruistic behavior because natural selection has determined it to be advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, have similarly evolved behavior for the same reason. As a result of sociobiological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality which functions well in the perpetuation of our species. But on an atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything that makes this morality objectively true. The philosopher of science Michael Ruse reports, the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. End quote. If we were to rewind the film of human evolution back to the beginning and start anew, people with a very different set of moral values might well have evolved. As Darwin himself wrote in The Descent of Man, if men were raised under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. For us to think that human beings are special and our morality objectively true is to succumb to the temptation of speciesism, that is to say, an unjustified bias toward one's own species. The objective worthlessness of human beings on a naturalistic worldview is underscored by two implications of that worldview: materialism and determinism. Naturalists are typically materialists or physicalists who regard man as a purely animal organism. But if there is no mind distinct from the brain, then everything we think and do is determined by the input of our five senses and our genetic makeup. There is no personal agent who freely decides to do something. But without freedom, none of our choices is morally significant. They're like the jerks of a puppet's limbs, controlled by the strings of sensory input and physical constitution. And what moral value does a puppet or its movements have? Richard Dawkins' assessment of human worth may be depressing, but why, on atheism, is he mistaken when he says, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. If there is no God, then any basis for regarding the herd morality evolved by Homo sapiens as objectively true seems to have been removed. Take God out of the picture, and all you seem to be left with is an ape-like creature on a tiny speck of dust beset with delusions of moral grandeur.
Craig argues that if there's no God, then moral values can't be objective. But that's simply false, and most contemporary philosophers know it. According to a massive 2020 Phil Papers survey of professional philosophers, over 70% believe in moral realism, that objective moral truths exist, while only a minority tie those truths to religion. Craig says evolution makes morality an illusion. But evolution explains how we became aware of morality, not that morality isn't real. Think about pain. It evolved to help us survive, but that doesn't make suffering an illusion. Same with morality. It's an evolved feature that lets us cooperate, prevent harm, and protect the vulnerable. And as for humans being just apes on a rock, that's emotional bait. The truth is, we're rational beings capable of empathy, reflection, and responsibility. Morality arises from our ability to weigh consequences, respect others, and seek fairness. That doesn't require a divine being. It requires thinking beings who care how their actions affect others.
Why is it wrong, peculiarly, for human beings to inflict harm on each other?
All right, so let's start with that. Suppose that my 3-year-old nephew walks into your house, takes some book off your shelf, and tears the pages out. He hasn't done anything wrong, or 3-year-old's probably old enough he has done something wrong. Make him a year and a half, he hasn't done anything wrong. If I go into your house, tear some pages out of your book, I've done something wrong. What's the difference? Well, I'm capable of appreciating reasons for respecting your property that my 1.5-year-old, this is hypothetical 1.5-year-old nephew, doesn't have the capacity, right? There are differences between people that allow me and you to think about our behaviors, to evaluate our behaviors, to see whether or not there are legitimate reasons for behaving as we do. Creatures that don't have that capacity don't have that capacity. It's precisely because they lack that capacity that makes no sense that the notion of right and wrong behavior gets no purchase. Lions can't reflect upon their behavior, so when they do it, it's not wrong. If you or I were to engage in that behavior, we can reflect upon that. We can recognize the reasons for not behaving that way. So I think the distinction is a fairly straightforward one, not a deep mystery or a hard challenge for the naturalist to respond to.
Okay, I think that's a good answer for why we wouldn't regard animals as moral agents who would be culpable for their acts. But it seems to me that at best that answer would go to show that rationality, or the ability to reflect rationally on things, is a necessary condition for moral behavior, but I don't see that that's a sufficient condition for moral behavior. It's still not clear to me why it would be wrong for creatures who have considerably complex neurological systems to inflict harm on each other on a naturalistic worldview in the struggle for survival.
Okay, so the question you asked initially was, how can I explain why it's wrong for me to murder when it's not wrong for lions to murder? And to answer that question, all it takes is for me to point out a relevant difference between us, and you've just, I think, said, yeah, all right, so I managed to do that. If we now shift to the question, so what does it take for wrongness to enter the world above and beyond rationality? I think the answer might well be, actually, once we achieve a certain level of rationality, nothing more is taken. Nothing more is needed. The reason it's objectively wrong for me to engage in murder is precisely because there is a reason for me not to do it, a reason that I'm capable of recognizing. And if you ask, well, what more does it take? The answer is, well, those are the basic ingredients right there. We can refine it. I mean, we can put a little icing on it if we'd like to make it. But in terms of the essentials, that's it. What there's reason for me to do depends on what kind of creature I am. Once I become the kind of creature in the evolutionary, process, once creatures evolve that are capable of stepping back from their actions, capable of reflecting about whether or not their behavior makes sense, whether it conforms to standards that they are themselves prepared to endorse, at that point the machinery is in place. And at that point there are reasons for me to behave in certain ways and to avoid other kinds of behavior. And if you ask, but what makes that wrong?
I'm still not clear as to why these beings suddenly achieve intrinsic moral worth in virtue of having these complex nervous systems that enables them to have self-reflection and so forth.
If you put it as complex nervous systems, it sounds pretty deflationary.
Right.
What's so special about having a complex nervous system? But of course, that complex nervous system allows you to do calculus. It allows you to do astrophysics. It allows you to write poetry. It allows you to fall in love. Put under that description, you ask, what's so special about humans from a naturalistic perspective? I'm at a loss to know how to answer that question. If you don't see why we'd be special and different from everything else in creation, that because we can do poetry, we can write a novel, we can think philosophical thoughts, we can do calculus, and we can think about the morality of our behavior, I don't know what kind of answer could possibly satisfy you at that point.
Well, obviously the kind of answer that I offered, but
can I ask just to follow up on that? Because I mean, I'm tempted to say I could play this game, and that's unfair, because of course it's not a game, but I could pose the same kinds of questions to you. Perhaps I will, in 10 minutes. I could say, look, all right, so God says, you guys are really, really special.
Right.
So, how does his saying it make us really special? But you see, he gave us a soul. How does our having a soul make us special? Whatever answer you give, you could always say, with regard to that, what's so special about that? At a certain point, you're just going to have to say, you know what? These features really do seem to me to be special, insofar as it seems to me that our ability to communicate, to reflect, to love, to be creative, and consequently to shape our behavior with an eye towards how we're interacting with one another, these things strike me as remarkable ways in which we're special.
Shelley Kagan's response cuts to the core of what makes morality work: self-awareness, empathy, and rationality. You don't need a divine spark. You need a mind capable of reflection and understanding. That's not a guess. It's supported by data. Cognitive scientists like Michael Tomasello have shown that once humans developed the ability to take another's perspective and understand shared intentions, moral reasoning emerged naturally. We're moral because we evolved the capacity to care, reflect, and cooperate, not because a divine being handed down commands. Craig wants morality to be about divine authority, but his view collapses under scrutiny. If God says something is wrong, is it wrong because he says so, or is it wrong for deeper reasons? That's the Euthyphro dilemma, and Craig never escapes it. If morality comes from God's commands, then genocide, slavery, or torture could be good if God wills it. And history shows this is more than a hypothetical. The Bible condones slavery, patriarchal violence, and genocide. That's not a moral foundation, it's moral hazard. And when Craig downplays evolution, he's ignoring reality. Moral emotions like guilt, empathy, and fairness aren't random. They're observable in humans and even in animals. Studies on capuchin monkeys, for example, show they reject unequal pay. That's a primitive sense of justice. No religion required. In short, Kagan's view fits what we actually see in the world. We don't need a lawgiver to understand fairness. We need minds capable of seeing others as people, not tools. That's what morality is built on. And it doesn't need God to exist. So the real question is, if our brains are wired for compassion and fairness, isn't that a better foundation than ancient rules written by people who thought slavery was moral? Let us know what you think. Drop a comment, like the video if this made sense, and subscribe for more clear, fact-based breakdowns of big questions.